It's a lovely hobby. 3 words. That's all it took to bulldoze 30 years of my life. My son, Alan, said them with a weak, apologetic smile, but the words weren't soft. They landed like stones. My hand tightened on the shears Frank gave me. The metal was cold against my palm, a sudden shock in the warm afternoon sun. I didn't tremble. Not yet. His wife, Brenda, beamed beside him, holding a glossy catalog open to a page of blindingly blue water. It was her idea. I could see it in the way she stood on my lawn, her heels sinking into the soft earth like little daggers. "It will fit perfectly right here," she'd said just moments before, waving a lazy hand. A single gesture that erased my husband's memory, my prize-winning roses, my peace. They looked at me, waiting for the tears, the protest, the hysterical old woman they expected. I gave them nothing. I looked past them, at the Queen Elizabeth rose Frank and I planted on our last anniversary, and I heard myself speak. The voice was mine, but it sounded distant, calm. "That's nice," I said. "For the children." Relief washed over their faces. Brenda's smile was triumphant. Victory was easy. They chattered happily as they walked back inside, their plans for saltwater systems and stamped concrete swallowing the quiet air. They left me alone with the ghosts they had just created. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of earth and roses filling my lungs. They had called it a hobby, a thing to be discarded. They thought they were talking about flowers. They had no idea they were talking about the deed. I looked down at the shears in my hand, then turned and walked toward the house, not in anger, not in sorrow, but with a purpose. My feet were steady on the stone path. I wasn't going to the kitchen to make tea. I was going to Frank's desk. They had made a classic business error. They had forgotten who owned the assets, and I was about to schedule a meeting they would never forget. That evening they talked about it over dinner, right in front of me. Brenda had the catalog open on the table next to her plate. "I think the porcelain tiles are a much classier look than the stamped concrete, don't you, honey?" she asked Alan. He agreed, of course. They talked about pool parties and night lighting and a fancy robotic cleaner. It was like I wasn't even there. Or if I was just part of the furniture, a silent witness to their grand plans. Noah, my grandson, was the only one who seemed quiet. He kept looking from me to his parents, his fork just pushing his peas around his plate. He understood. At 12, he understood more than his father. The next morning, I saw them from the same kitchen window. Little red flags on thin metal stakes. They were dotted all over the lawn, marching in a neat, brutal rectangle right through the heart of the garden. There was one stuck in the earth not 6 inches from the base of my peace rose, the one that took me 3 years to nurture into a proper bush. There was another right in the middle of my English roses, the fragrant, cabbagey ones that remind me of my mother. They were like little wounds, little drops of blood on the green grass. The surveyor must have come and gone at dawn, quiet and efficient, an executioner making his final marks. I felt a tremor start in my hands. I wrapped them around my mug of coffee, but it didn't help. This was real. They weren't just talking. They had taken the next step. They had staked their claim on my land, on my life's work, without so much as a word to me. They saw my nod, my quiet, "That's nice," and took it as a blank check to bring in the bulldozers. The anger came then. It was a slow, rising heat that started in my belly and spread through my chest. It wasn't a hot, shouting anger. It was cold, a deep, glacial rage. They hadn't just insulted me. They had assumed I was powerless. They had assumed that my life, my passions, my memories were disposable, a hobby. I knew I couldn't fight them with words. It would be my sentimentality against their practicality, my hobby against their investment. I would be the hysterical old woman standing in the way of progress and family fun. I had to surrender first. I had to make it official. My hands were shaking so much I had to dial the number twice. I picked up the old rotary phone in the hall. I've always preferred the weight of it. I called Mr. Higgins. You know, the head of the Rose Society. A fussy, proper man, but he knows more about roses than anyone I've ever met. Rosalind, a pleasure, he answered, his voice crisp. I trust the Heritage are behaving themselves. I expect big things from you at the show this year. I had to swallow before I could speak. My throat felt tight. Actually, Albert, I said, and my voice came out as a whisper. That's why I'm calling. I need to withdraw from the competition this year. There was a silence on the other end of the line, a thick, disapproving silence. Withdraw, he finally said, the word sounding like a heresy. Rosalind, you haven't missed a competition in 20 years. Are you unwell? I'm fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's the garden. It's not going to be here much longer. What on earth are you talking about? Did you get Japanese beetles? I have a new systemic spray I can recommend. No, Albert. I cut him off. It's a pool. My son is putting in a swimming pool. I told him where. I described the red flags. I didn't have to add any emotion to my voice. The bare facts were horrible enough. I heard him take a sharp breath. For a full 10 seconds, he said nothing. Then he spoke, and his voice was low, filled with a fury that mirrored my own. A pool, he repeated, as if the word itself was poison. They are going to destroy that garden. For a pool? That's not just a shame, Rosalind. That is an act of barbarism. Barbarism, that was the word. The perfect word. It wasn't a disagreement. It wasn't a different point of view. It was an invasion. It was the destruction of something beautiful and complex for something shallow and simple. Hearing him say it, hearing my own quiet grief reflected back at me as righteous indignation, it was like a steel rod being lowered into my spine. My shaking stopped. The coldness in my chest solidified into purpose. Thank you, Albert, I said, and my voice was clear now, firm. I just wanted to let you know. I hung up the phone. I walked back to the kitchen and looked out the window at those little red flags. They didn't look like wounds anymore. They looked like a declaration of war. They had planted their flags on my roses, on my memories, on my land. Fine, I thought, as I walked calmly towards Frank's old desk. War is what they'll get. I was no. After I hung up the phone with Mr. Higgins, I sat there for a long time, just looking at the wall. Barbarism. The word was a bell that wouldn't stop ringing in my head. He was right. And it made me realize something. You don't reason with barbarians. You don't try to explain the value of art to them while they're holding the torch. You build a wall, a very strong, very clear wall. The rest of the day was a fog. Alan and Brenda were in high spirits. They had a contractor coming the next week to give them a quote. They talked about it loudly, cheerfully, as if they were planning a surprise party for me. Brenda was on her tablet, looking at outdoor furniture. Wicker is so dated, she announced to no one in particular. I'm thinking of something more minimalist. Clean lines, to go with the concrete box they were going to put in the middle of my living, breathing garden. I just nodded and sipped my tea. They took my silence for agreement. They always have. My quietness has always been a convenience for them, a space they could fill with their own noise, their own plans. They had no idea that my silence had finally turned into something solid, something hard. The next morning, I didn't go into the garden. I couldn't bear to look at those red flags. Instead, I went to Frank's desk. It's an old oak thing, heavy and solid, just like he was. I opened the bottom right drawer. It still has that familiar smell of old paper, cedar, and a faint hint of his pipe tobacco. And there it was, the file, neatly labeled, deed and title, 412 Willow Creek Lane. I didn't need a lawyer to read it. My name was right there, Rosalind M. Gable, sole proprietor. Frank had insisted on putting the house in my name alone years ago. You're the one who makes this place a home, he'd said. It's yours, always. It was an act of love, of foresight. I just never imagined I'd need it as a weapon against our own son. I found the number for the law firm we used for our wills, Gable and Sons. Old Mr. Gable was long gone, but his son, Robert, had taken over. I remember him as a boy, all knees and elbows. Now he was a man in his 50s with a serious face and a kind handshake. Making that call felt strange, like I was crossing a line. We were a family that solved its problems at the kitchen table, not in a lawyer's office, but the kitchen table wasn't working anymore. It had been taken over by catalogs for swimming pools. Rosalind, Robert Gable said when I was put through. His voice was warm. It's been a while. I hope everyone is well. Everyone is fine, Robert, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to come in. I have a property matter I need to discuss. His office was just as I remembered it. Books from floor to ceiling. The air thick with the smell of leather and dust. It was a place of facts and precedents, a world away from the emotional chaos of my home. I sat across the desk from him, the same one his father had used, and I told him everything. I didn't cry. I just laid out the facts, the 30 years, the competition, the catalog, the red flags. I finished by telling him what Alan had said. He called it a hobby, I said, and my voice finally cracked on that one word. Robert Gable listened patiently. He didn't interrupt. He just steepled his fingers and watched me, his eyes thoughtful. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. He wasn't looking at me like I was a silly old woman making a fuss over some flowers. He was looking at me like a client whose rights were being violated. So, to be clear, Rosalind, he said, his voice calm and professional. The property is entirely in your name. You pay the property taxes. Your son and his family live there as guests, with your permission. Yes, I said. They've lived with me for 5 years, ever since Alan lost his job at the firm. They never really got back on their feet enough to move out. I hadn't even thought of that part. I had taken them in, and this was how they were repaying me. And you have not given them permission to begin any major construction or landscaping projects? No, I said. They told me they were doing it. They didn't ask. He nodded slowly. I see. He leaned back in his chair. Well, the law is very clear on this. They have no legal right to alter your property without your express written consent. We can put a stop to this immediately. I felt a wave of relief, so powerful, it almost made me dizzy. It wasn't just my feelings anymore. It was the law. The law was on my side. What do we do? I asked. We start with a formal notice, he said. Nothing aggressive. We're not talking about eviction at this stage. We are simply establishing, in clear and legally binding terms, that you are the sole owner of the property and that any and all unauthorized work is strictly prohibited. It will state that any attempt to dig, build, or otherwise alter the landscape will be considered willful destruction of property and trespass. He used words like cease and desist and indemnification. They were cold, hard words. They felt like stones I could build my wall with. He drafted the letter right there while I waited. It was 1 page long, crisp, formal, and utterly unambiguous. It was my quiet pain translated into a language no one could pretend not to understand. He made 2 copies, put the original in a heavy cream-colored envelope with his firm's letterhead on it, and handed it to me. How should I give it to them? I asked, holding the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. Robert Gable looked at me. You can have me mail it, and it will arrive in a day or 2. Or you can simply leave it for them to find. Sometimes the quietest statements are the loudest. I knew what I had to do. That evening, the house was filled with the smell of Brenda's cooking. She was trying out some fancy new recipe with fennel. She and Alan were at the kitchen table, laughing about something they'd seen on TV. The pool catalog was sitting between them, a permanent fixture now. They had already picked out the color of the liner, azure shimmer, Brenda called it. I said goodnight and went to my room, the letter tucked inside my cardigan. I sat on my bed for a long time, just holding it. This was it. The moment everything would change. There would be no going back to the comfortable illusion that we were one big, happy family. But that illusion was already shattered. They had shattered it with their glossy pictures and their little red flags. I waited until I heard their bedroom door close. I waited another hour after that, until the whole house was still and dark. The only sound was the familiar hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. I slipped out of my room and went downstairs. The moonlight was streaming through the kitchen window, making everything look silver and gray. And there it was, the catalog, open to the page with the azure shimmer pool. It looked obscene in the quiet moonlight, an alien thing. My hand was perfectly steady. I took the heavy cream envelope from my pocket. I didn't put it next to the catalog. I placed it directly on top, right over the picture of the smiling family and their perfect, soulless pool. The formal, embossed letterhead of Gable & Sons, attorneys at law, was the only thing visible. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, the letter and the catalog, my reality and their fantasy, my rights and their desires. It was all there, on the kitchen table. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt a great, deep calm. I had done what needed to be done. I had put things in order. I had weeded my garden. I went back upstairs to bed. I didn't know what the morning would bring. Shouting, probably. Tears, maybe. But I knew one thing for sure. There would be no digging. These's and do's. I woke up before the sun. For the first time in days, I had slept soundly, a deep, dreamless sleep. There was no anxiety churning in my stomach. There was only a quiet, settled calm. I knew what I had done, and I knew why I had done it. There was no regret. I made my coffee and took it outside. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the faint, peppery scent of the Gertrude Jekyll roses. The little red flags were still there, an ugly rash on my lawn, but they didn't have the same power over me anymore. They were no longer a verdict. They were just litter. I put on my gardening gloves and picked up my twine. The climbing new dawn on the trellis needed tending. Its branches were heavy with buds, reaching for the morning light. I began to work, my fingers moving with a familiar, easy rhythm, tying the new growth gently to the wooden slats, securing its future. It was a hopeful act. I was tending to life. That's what I do. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't hear the sliding door at first. It was the sound of it slamming back into its frame that made me look up. Brenda stood on the patio, framed in the doorway like an avenging angel. But there was nothing angelic about her face. It was tight with fury. In her hand, she held the cream-colored envelope, clutching it like it was a weapon she was about to use. Alan was right behind her, his face pale and blotchy, a mixture of disbelief and anger. "What is this?" Brenda's voice cut through the morning quiet. It was sharp and ugly. I finished tying a knot around a long, flexible cane of the rose bush before I turned to them. I kept the shears in my other hand, their weight familiar and comforting. "Good morning," I said, my voice even. "Don't you good morning us," Alan burst out, stepping forward. He looked more lost than angry. "A letter, Mom? From a lawyer? You sent your own family a letter from a lawyer?" "I didn't send it," I replied calmly. "I left it for you on the table." Brenda stormed across the grass, the letter held out in front of her. "This is insane. Completely insane. How could you do this to us, to your own grandchildren? This was for them." "Don't you care about their happiness?" "This is my home," I said, my voice still quiet. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. "And this is my garden." "It's a bunch of flowers," she shrieked, her voice rising. "We are trying to improve this property, to add value, to create a space for our family, and you go behind our backs and do this? This is the most selfish, passive-aggressive thing I have ever seen." I looked at my son. His face was working, his jaw tight. "She's right, Mom. This is a betrayal. We're your family. You're supposed to be on our side." I finally turned my full attention to them. I looked at Brenda's furious face and Alan's wounded one. I saw the catalog they'd left on the patio table. I saw the red flags on my lawn. And I felt nothing. The part of me that would have once crumbled under their disapproval was gone. It had been pruned away. I took a step toward the peace rose, turning away from them slightly. I saw a sucker, a useless bit of growth sprouting from the rootstock. I bent down. "Everything you need to know is in that letter," I said, my focus on the plant. "This is my land. There will be no pool built here. The conversation is over." With a quick, clean movement, I used my shears. Snip. The sucker came away in my hand. I tossed it aside. "The conversation is not over." Alan's voice was louder now, shaking with rage. "You don't just get to do this! We live here! We've made plans! We have a contractor coming next week!" Just then, a car crunched on the gravel of the driveway. An old, respectable-looking sedan. A moment later, a car door closed. We all turned. Walking up the path, holding his hat in his hand, was Mr. Higgins. He was dressed in his usual tweed jacket and crisply ironed trousers. He looked like a man from another time, a time when things like courtesy and respect still mattered. He stopped when he saw us, his eyes taking in the scene: Brenda's aggressive stance, Alan's red face, and me, standing with pruning shears in my hand. He gave a slight, formal nod. "Rosalind, my dear," he said, his voice a calm island in the middle of our storm. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Albert," I said, and a genuine smile touched my lips for the first time that morning. "Not at all. I'm so glad you came." I turned my back on Alan and Brenda, a simple, final dismissal. Alan and Brenda just stood there, speechless. Their family tantrum had suddenly acquired a formal audience. They looked small and foolish. Mr. Higgins' gaze drifted over the red flags, and a look of profound sadness crossed his face. He looked back at me, his eyes full of understanding. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though we both knew it was a lie. "I wanted to come and pay my respects to the garden." His words hung in the air, a quiet tribute to what they had been so ready to destroy. He was honoring my hobby. He was seeing my life's work for what it was. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs, clean and fresh. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. In its place was a certainty as deep as the roots of the oldest rose in my garden. "You're just in time, Albert," I said, my voice clear and strong. I walked towards him, leaving my son and his wife standing like statues in the middle of the lawn. I gestured toward my prize-winning climbers. Let me show you the new dawn. The blooms this year are going to be extraordinary. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their stunned, furious silence behind me. In my hand, the cool, solid weight of the shears felt less like a tool and more like a scepter. I was the queen in my own garden, and my reign had just begun. Manger. The day ended as it had begun, with a confrontation. But this one was different. It wasn't fueled by the hot, surprised anger of the morning. This was a cold, planned ambush. They waited until after dinner, after the dishes were cleared and Noah was supposedly in his room doing homework. They cornered me in the living room. It felt like a trial. Brenda and Alan stood before me like prosecutors, while I sat in my armchair, the one Frank and I bought together 50 years ago. The fabric is worn, but it fits me perfectly. Brenda spoke first. Her tone had changed. She was no longer shouting. She was using that low, reasonable voice that is more dangerous than any scream. It's the voice of someone who believes they have the absolute moral high ground. Rosalind, she began, as if we were discussing a minor disagreement over the grocery list. We need to talk about this rationally. You've had your little demonstration. You've made your point. But this has gone far enough. A lawyer? It was a cruel thing to do. It was a necessary thing to do. I corrected her gently. You left me no other choice. Alan started pacing. He couldn't keep still. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd had since he was a boy, whenever he was frustrated. A choice, Mom? I came to you with an idea to make this house better for everyone, for the kids. And you treated me like an intruder, like a criminal. You put stakes in my garden, Alan, I said, my voice quiet. You marked it for destruction without my permission. What would you call that? He stopped pacing and glared at me, and that's when the real accusation came, the one he'd been holding back, the one he thought was his trump card. This isn't about the garden, is it? This is about you. You don't want the kids to be happy. You don't want them out there laughing and playing. You'd rather just sit here alone with your memories. It's selfish. You're punishing your own grandchildren because you can't stand to see anyone else happy. The words hit me, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little my own son knew me, that he could believe, even for a second, that my heart was that small, that withered. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would bring me handfuls of dandelions from the yard, convinced they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. And I saw the man he had become, a man who couldn't see the difference between a dandelion and a prize-winning rose, between life and plastic. And the sadness I felt was so profound. It washed away all the anger. I don't hate my grandchildren, Alan, I said, and my voice was clear, without a tremor. I love them more than you can possibly imagine. I hate what you are trying to teach them. He stared at me, confused. What are you talking about? You're teaching them that something that takes 30 years to build can be destroyed for 5 minutes of fun. You're teaching them that beauty doesn't matter if it's inconvenient, that a person's life's work is just a hobby that can be paved over for something new and shiny. This garden is everything that's left of your father and me. It's in every root, every leaf. When you said you were going to put a pool there, I paused, and my gaze was locked on his. You weren't just talking about pouring concrete on the earth. You were talking about pouring it over my memories, over our memories. That's not true. Brenda cut in, her voice sharp. That's emotional blackmail. Frank would have wanted the kids to have a pool. My husband, I said, my voice dropping, becoming as hard as stone, taught his son how to build things, not how to tear them down. Alan flinched as if I'd slapped him. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, and in that silence, we heard a small sound from the doorway. We all turned. Noah was standing there. He was in his pajamas. In his hands, he was holding his little garden trowel, the one I'd given him for his 7th birthday. His face was pale, and he looked like he was about to cry, but his chin was set with a kind of fierce determination. He didn't look at his parents. His eyes were fixed on me. "Grandma?" he said, his small voice cutting through all the tension and bitterness in the room. Is it okay if I help you? I want to move the little prince before the bulldozer comes. We can put him in a pot. He's my favorite." The air left the room. Brenda just stared, her mouth slightly open. Alan looked at his son, and his angry, righteous expression just collapsed. It crumbled into something else, something that looked an awful lot like shame. Their entire argument, their whole justification, it's for the children, had just been dismantled by a 12-year-old boy in pajamas holding a trowel. Noah hadn't just chosen a side. He had chosen a world where you save beautiful things, you don't destroy them. I felt tears welling up in my own eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of overwhelming hope. He remembered. He understood. All those hours I had spent with him in the garden, showing him how to tell the difference between a sucker and a new cane, telling him the stories behind each rose. It wasn't for nothing. It had taken root. I didn't say another word to Alan or Brenda. I didn't need to. Their son had said it all. I slowly pushed myself up from my armchair and walked over to my grandson. I knelt down in front of him, even though my old knees protested. I put my hand over his on the handle of the little trowel. "There's no bulldozer coming, my love," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You saved him. You saved them all." I hugged him, and he wrapped his arms tightly around my neck. And in the silent living room, with my son and his wife watching, I knew I hadn't just won a battle over a piece of land. I had ensured that the garden would live on, not just in the soil, but in a heart that knew its worth. I had break to a flind. After that night in the living room, the fight was over. There was no more shouting, no more pleading, no more talk of azure shimmer pools. The silence in the house was a new kind. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with resentment and things left unsaid. Alan and Brenda moved around me like ghosts. They would get their own coffee, make their own meals, and retreat to their room. They spoke to each other in whispers. They never spoke to me at all. I don't know what they said to each other after Noah went to bed that night. I don't care to know. But I knew that a crack had been opened in our family, and it was one that could not be sealed. They hadn't just attacked my garden. They had tried to use their own child as a weapon, and it had backfired on them completely. They couldn't look at me, but worse, they couldn't seem to look at Noah either. The sight of him was a constant reminder of their defeat. I knew they couldn't stay. Not like this. The house had become a prison of their own making. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about mercy. It was about letting everyone breathe again. I called Robert Gable the next day. My voice didn't shake this time. I explained the situation. "It's time," I said. "They need to find their own place, their own life." The notice arrived by certified mail a week later. I didn't hand it to them. I let the law do its work. It was a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. It was a clean, legal, and impersonal severing. When Alan found it on the front step, he didn't come to me to yell. He just read it. His shoulders slumped and walked back inside. The next day, the moving boxes appeared. The last few weeks were a strange, sad ballet. The sound of packing tape being ripped from the roll was the only conversation they seemed to have. They systematically emptied their lives from the rooms of my house. I stayed out of their way. I spent most of my time in the garden, where the air was clean. Noah would often join me after school. We didn't talk about his parents. We talked about aphids and ladybugs, about the proper way to mulch, about which roses would bloom first. We were building something new while the old was being dismantled just a few yards away. One afternoon, I was watching Brenda carry a box of her expensive, minimalist vases out to their car. She moved with a kind of grim determination, her face a hard mask. She never looked at the garden. It was as if it didn't exist, as if she had willed it invisible. I felt a pang of something, not pity exactly, but a deep, sorrowful ache for the son I had raised and the family I thought we were. Later that day, I found Noah. He was in the back of the garden, by the trellis, carefully weeding around the base of the little Prince rose. He was so gentle, his small fingers pulling out the clover without disturbing the roots. I walked over and stood beside him for a moment, just watching. He looked up and gave me a small smile. "He looks happier," Noah said, patting the soil. "He is," I said, "thanks to you." I reached into the pocket of my apron and my fingers closed around the object I'd put there that morning. It was an old key, made of brass, worn smooth from years of use. It was the key to the back gate of the garden, the one Frank had installed so he could slip out for his morning walks. "I have something for you," I said. I held it out on the palm of my hand. Noah looked at the key, then back up at me, his eyes wide. "What's it for?" "It's for the gate," I said. "This garden, it's not just mine anymore, Noah. It's yours too. We're its caretakers now, together." He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took the key. He closed his small hand around it, his knuckles white for a second. He understood it wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a trust. "You can come and go whenever you want," I continued softly. "Even when you're living somewhere else, this will always be your place, our place." He finally looked up from the key, and I saw his own future in his clear, honest eyes. He wasn't just my grandson anymore. He was my heir. Not heir to a house or to money, but to something far more important. He was the heir to the garden, and to everything it meant. A week later, the moving truck came and went. The house was quiet again. A real, peaceful quiet. It felt bigger somehow. That evening, I sat in my armchair and watched the sunset through the living room window. I felt a profound sadness, the kind you feel when a fever finally breaks. A loss, but also a cleansing. Then I heard a small, familiar sound. The click of the old brass lock on the back garden gate. A few minutes later, Noah came in through the sliding door, the key clutched in his hand. He had a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "I thought the Mr. Lincoln looked a little thirsty," he said. I smiled. "I think you were right. I had lost my son. But I had not been left alone. The garden was safe, and its future was in good hands." Oh, and a month passed. The silence in the house lost its heavy, mournful quality and became something else. It became my own again. The quiet was filled, not with absence, but with the familiar sounds. I'd almost forgotten the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the chirping of the sparrows nesting in the eaves, the rustle of the rose leaves in the afternoon breeze. The house breathed again, and so did I. I re-entered the competition. It felt important to do so. Not to win, but to stand there and say, without words, that the garden had survived. When they called my name, I was genuinely surprised. I walked up to the little stage they'd set up at the community hall, and Albert Higgins handed me the plaque and the big, silky blue ribbon. He didn't just shake my hand. He took it in both of his and gave it a firm, respectful squeeze. "For the roses, Rosalind," he whispered, his eyes twinkling, "and for the barbarian eviction." We both shared a small, secret smile. It was a lovely moment. The applause was warm, and many old friends came up to congratulate me, but it felt public. The real celebration happened the next day. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the sun feels like honey on your skin. I made a pot of my favorite Earl Grey tea and took it out to the garden, along with 2 cups and the blue ribbon. Noah was already there, sitting on the steps of the old gazebo, a simple school notebook open on his lap. He was sketching, his brow furrowed in concentration. I didn't say anything, just set the tray down on the little wicker table. He looked up and smiled. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the ribbon I was holding. "That's our prize," I said. "First place." His eyes went wide. "Wow, you won." "No," I said, handing the silky fabric to him. "We won." His small fingers touched the ribbon, tracing the gold letters. It was just a bit of blue silk, really, but in that moment, it felt like the most valuable thing in the world. "What should we do with it?" he asked. "I have an idea," I said. I found a small tack in the old gardening tin where I keep bits of string and wire. I pointed to the main beam of the gazebo, right in the center, where a bit of paint was peeling. "Right there," I said, "where we can see it every day." Noah stood on the bench and I held him steady by the waist. He carefully pressed the tack into the old soft wood, and the blue ribbon fluttered down, a splash of brilliant color against the weathered white paint. It wasn't a trophy in a glass case. It was a part of the garden now, a charm, a promise. We sat and drank our tea. For a while, we just watched the ribbon dance in the breeze. Then, Noah shyly pushed his notebook across the table towards me. "I've been trying to draw them all," he said quietly, "so I don't forget their names." I opened it. Page after page, he had sketched the roses. They weren't perfect drawings, of course. They were a child's drawings, a little wobbly and out of proportion. But that's not what I saw. I saw that he had captured the cup shape of the heritage rose. I saw that he had tried to draw the ruffled edges of the Gertrude Jekyll. Under each sketch, in his neat, careful printing, was the name, Mr. Lincoln, Queen Elizabeth, the little prince. He had even noted which ones smelled the best. I turned the pages, and I couldn't speak. This was the real prize. This was the legacy. Not a plaque, not a ribbon, but this quiet act of love and attention. This passing of knowledge from my heart to his. I looked at my grandson, his head bent over his cup of tea, a smudge of pencil dust on his nose. I thought of Alan and Brenda and their glossy catalogs and their loud talk of investing in family leisure. They had wanted to pour their money into a hole in the ground filled with blue water, and it took this small boy, with a school notebook and a bit of dirt still under his fingernails, to understand what a real investment was. It wasn't about money. It was about time. It was about getting down on your knees, in the soil, and patiently helping something living and beautiful to grow.